Harris, Trump in neck and neck fight.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there.
We have an opportunity in this election to turn the page on a decade of Donald Trump trying to keep us divided and afraid of each other. That is who he is, but Madison, that is not who we are.
Immigration, race, gender, key factors.
So when India, which is a very big abuser, he happens to be coming to meet me next week, and Modi, he's fantastic man.
You know, I think about my own mother, and all 5 feet of her, a beautiful brown woman with an accent, who convinced me and my sister Maya that there's nothing we couldn't do.
How will US poll impact India? US election roundtable.
Hello and welcome, namaskar, to this Diwali weekend roundtable special. 2024 has been a year of big elections around the world. In the next few days, we'll see one of the most globally significant elections of 2024. America, the United States of America, votes next week in a presidential election that has arguably been the most polarized that country has ever seen. Can Republican candidate Donald Trump stage a famous comeback 4 years after he was ousted rather unceremoniously and left the White House in controversial circumstances? Or will Kamala Harris, the Democratic nominee and vice president, become the first woman president of the United States? Whoever wins, America and the world could see tectonic change in an increasingly turbulent world. What does this election then mean for India and the world? That's going to be our roundtable special, where we are joined by special guests. Jayant Krishna is Senior Fellow, Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Irfan Nuruddin is Professor Indian Politics at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Kanwal Sibal is former Foreign Secretary of the country, and Promit Pal Chaudhary is Head of India Practice at the Eurasia Group. I appreciate all of you joining me here on the show today. Let me put up big questions and we'll go to them one by one. And I want to start by the first big question. Why does this US election matter so much to India and the world? Why is this such a significant election this time? Irfan Nuruddin there in Georgetown, tell us, why is this election being seen as such a landmark one?
You know, all elections have consequences, and in this case, you have two very different viewpoints, not just about domestic politics, but about America's place in the world. Donald Trump, we've seen the record already, right? He was president, after all, for 4 years, from 2016 to 2020, and showed an inclination, really, in his rhetoric to put America first. But what that translated into was maybe a disregard for America's traditional commitments to its alliances, a willingness to sort of upend the playbook in terms of global governance by embracing tariffs. For instance, criticizing the World Trade Organization. Under his leadership, America withdrew its support for the World Health Organization at a terrible time, given that we were in a global pandemic. You have Trump's very vocal sort of advocacy for Russian positions, maybe, particularly in the context of, of the Ukraine war. So you just have somebody who's really takes a very different position about what America stands for in the world. Mm-hmm. And in Kamala Harris, you have much more of a conventional center-left politician. At the end of the day, as you mentioned, she is vice president, so the Biden-Harris administration will, if she wins, turn into the Harris-Walz administration, but we would expect a lot of continuity over there, in particular doubling down on American support for NATO and for Europe, continued pressure on Russia as a significant strategic opponent, and maybe much more continuity, but with some room for maybe negotiation with China. Mm-hmm. Trump is just a wild card. And so when it comes to India, I think India arguably is in a favorable position for both candidates, in that India is seen as a bedrock of American foreign policy in Asia. But with Harris, we could imagine what the contours of that look like. With Trump, it's a wild card. We don't know whether that means Trump says India has to be our main partner in opposing China, or whether Trump decides that his anti-trade, anti-immigration rhetoric puts India in the crosshairs, and suddenly he decides that Indians are stealing American jobs and levels a lot of tariffs. So I think it really is the polarizing nature of these two foreign policy positions, and in particular the wild card nature of Trump that makes this election so significant for foreign policy and for India.
Irfan Nuruddin, you've used the word wild card 4 times already. Let me take that word to you, Jayant Krishna, also in Washington. Trump a wild card versus Harris, who may represent continuity, many believe. But there are those observers who believe Trump's unpredictability is also his strength. He could perhaps break deadlocks which seem at the moment intractable, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, whether it's the war in the Middle East. How should India and the world look at a potential Trump presidency?
Yeah, so Rajdeep, first of all, US still thinks that they are some kind of a beacon to the world, and many in the world also believe that's the case. But if you look at over the years, their power to influence, the decisions of nations and also resolve conflicts has been reducing quite a lot. It has become rather limited now. But the fact is, given their economic clout and their military power, they're still a very, very, perhaps the most consequential actor in the global, arena. So I think if you look at there's a huge contrast between the two candidates. If you look at Trump, he's all for Americanism and somehow with the low regard for globalism. That's very, very clear. As the world should behave more multilaterally, I think Trump has been America first has been his policy, and more of a unilateral thing that he does all the time. So I think this election is also very interesting because it's happening at a time when the regional powers are going their own way and they don't really listen to any major power. UN has become weak, and the fact is the US remains the largest funder for the UN to the tune of about, if I'm not mistaken, $20 billion per annum. Russia-Ukraine war, we all know which way it is going. Middle East crisis is very well known. China thinks that they're second to none, and they'll do everything to eclipse US.
So would a Trump presidency change all that? That's what's been happening in the last few years, as opposed to a Harris presidency. Is it a battle between continuity and change?
So I think if you compare and contrast the two candidates, one thing is very clear, that Trump is a bit unpredictable. Some of his policies could even be divisive vis-a-vis Kamala Harris, whose leadership would be more humanitarian, more, I would say, a more responsible and very, very principled kind of leadership, one can expect from Kamala Harris. There'll be huge amount of policy continuity vis-a-vis, from the Joe Biden era onwards, If you look at few of the critical issues in the world, let's talk about Ukraine. I think Kamala Harris, if she comes to power, her decisions would be and actions would be more pro-Ukraine. If you look at Trump, he has said that his admiration for Putin is known very well. He says that he's a strong leader, and that is what he is. He admires. Mm-hmm. As far as China is concerned, I would think that Trump would be more decisive in terms of curbs on China. They've already said that almost 60% of import duty they would levy on goods coming from China. So I think on predictability, right. I would believe Kamala Harris would be quite predictable vis-a-vis Trump. That's very, very clear, Rajdeep.
Okay, so it's predictable, more than continuity versus change. Let's call it predictability versus unpredictability. That perhaps is why, in a way, this election is so fascinating for one, because Trump is, as was just described, a bit of an outsider. Pramit Pal Chaudhary, you're with us. How do you see it, therefore? Why does this US election matter so much to India and the world? How would the world order change depending on who wins? Will anything change at all?
Well, there will definitely be some changes, but I will stress continuity here. I would argue that the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, had remarkable strands of continuity. The U.S. position on China In many ways, I would give Trump credit for calling out China in a manner that previous administrations had been unwilling to do. Biden maintained exactly the same posture. If you talk to the Chinese, they said we cannot tell the difference between the two regimes. The same tariffs, the same position on Taiwan, and in many ways, I would, and the same argument that China, in effect, is the major disruptor and major threat to the United States. And it's one of the reasons that India remains, and the Indian system actually gives credit to Trump and his first team, that they were able to come out and say that, look, China has to be called out among a lot of what it does. Where there is a difference, however, where there is a difference would be in Ukraine, where Trump is very clear. His team, if you look at his foreign policy team, one point that is consistent is that America, that the Europeans in particular, but many other American allies, have to contribute more and have not contributed enough to the defense of things like the Ukraine, and that they cannot continue to live on the United States. Biden has also said that to some degree, but he's much more of an old World War II, Cold War person, that America's allies must be supported nonetheless. So that is going to be a shift, and that's one of the reasons Ukraine is probably the country most nervous about the return of a Trump. What is interesting, though, what everybody has mentioned correctly, is on trade. But Trump talks a lot more negatively about trade than he actually does. The real game, as far as I can see, and we look at people like Lighthizer and those on his team and what they have said, is that Trump uses tariffs to seek a deal. He likes to he's prepared to give you a carve-out, but you have to make certain concessions. And we can go into what I would expect that type of a carve-out to be for India. The problem is that for China, it is not clear at all that they can actually strike such a deal with Trump because their, should we say, crimes against the international trading system are far too egregious.
Okay, interesting the way you're putting it. Kamal Sibal, your take on that first big question. Why does this election matter so much to India and the world? What, according to you, is going to be the main distinction between a Trump and a Harris presidency?
I think all that has been said by the various panelists is relevant in this regard. It's clear that Trump and Kamala Harris are two very different candidates with very different agendas. We are familiar with their agendas. In one case, Trump was president for 4 years and we dealt with him. And in the other case, although she was not president, she was vice president. And she says that she will follow the policies of Biden, which she will, I think, largely. So we are familiar with that agenda too. So there are positives and negatives on both sides, in the sense that Trump has been supportive of India. He has good personal chemistry with Modi. He's been, of course, talking a bit loosely about how he admires Modi. And at the same time, he says that he's a tough guy and he threatens to impose tariffs on India because he thinks that we are worse than even China with regard to tariffs, something like that. So we should be prepared for some unpleasant surprises when it comes to the economic side. But in other respects, I think there will not be any great difference between how he dealt with India in his previous 4 years and now. With regard to Biden or Kamala Harris, I think there'll be continuity of policy. There were some very, very important decisions taken with regard to on the technology side, on the defense side, and on various areas which are very important for India's growth story. So that will continue. On the other hand, in terms of issues of democracy and human rights and minorities and all that, we may actually find that there might be more pressure on us. And therefore, it will be a kind of a situation where we draw closer to the United States, but it will also be, we will be also more distrustful of certain aspects of democratic policy towards India or Kamala Harris towards India. On the whole, let me say like this, that, the election is important for the simple reason that the United States is the most powerful country in the world. So whatever this president does or the decisions they take have an impact on the rest of the world inevitably. And the rest of the world has not been able to cushion itself from the policies of the United States, both positive and negative. And therefore, we'll have to wait and see how it pans out. With regard to Ukraine, yes, Trump says that he'll be able to solve the problem in a few minutes. I think he's being rather casual about the whole thing. And Medvedev, the former president of Russia, the prime minister, also has said very clearly, what if we don't agree with what he says? Then at the same time, he says that he'll threaten Russia. So let's see what happens on that front. It's not going to be as easy as he thinks. Europe is terribly, terribly worried. And Zelensky and the Ukrainian government are actually having nightmares at the idea that Trump may come to power.
Right.
They'll much rather that Kamala Harris comes to power, and there's continuity in that policy. But if he settles the issues with Russia or lowers tension, it is helpful to us and the global South in general.
Okay, interesting. These are preliminary remarks, of course, to try and put some context to this election. Let's talk for a moment on the election itself. Has this election split America wide open? And before we come to our panelists on the roundtable, I want to play some sound bites that we have from what's been happening in America. More recently, comments made at a Trump rally in New York, targeting Puerto Ricans, response from Biden, how Kamala Harris and Trump have been targeting each other. Just listen in to how it's been playing out in America.
Remember Hillary, she said deplorable? And then she said irredeemable, right? But she said deplorable. That didn't work out. Garbage, I think, is worse, right? But he doesn't know. You have to please forgive him. Please forgive him, for he not knoweth what he said. These people, it's terrible, terrible. Terrible to say a thing like that, but he really doesn't know. He really, honestly, he doesn't. And I'm convinced that he likes me more than he likes Kamala. Convinced. And I'm so proud that we're getting support from Latinos like never before. We're setting every record. Hispanics, Latinos. Nobody loves our Latino community and our Puerto Rican community more than I do. Nobody. You know, it's interesting because I've done more for Puerto Rico than any president by far. Nobody close. I provided historic funding and the hospital ship when they were hit with a couple of really bad ones right in the road. We got the ship over there with thousands of rooms, actually. It was amazing. A floating hospital, the biggest in the world. I will deliver the best future for Puerto Ricans and for Hispanic Americans.
Oh, the Puerto Rican that I know, or Puerto Rico, where I'm in my home state of Delaware, they're good, decent, honorable people. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. His demonization of Latinos is unconscionable, and it's un-American. It's totally contrary to everything we've done.
We have to stop pointing fingers and start locking arms. It is time to turn the page on the drama and the conflict, the fear and division. It is time for a new generation of leadership in America. And I am ready to offer that leadership as the next President of the United States of America.
Irfan Nuruddin, Puerto Rico, of course, the latest conflict point, a comedian at a Trump rally saying island of garbage, and then you saw the responses to that. Is this election right to the very end about polarization, about demonization, about anti-immigrant rhetoric? And does that help Trump because he has split America wide open?
Yeah, he's split America wide open, but he's also just exposed faults that those of us who pay attention to American politics could recognize over the last 100 years, right? I mean, the Republican strategy in the 1960s came to be called the Southern strategy, and that was about focusing on white grievances in what was the American South, the once slaveholding states, that has now become dominant. The biggest cleavage in American politics are twofold. One is gender, which is growing as more women of all age groups, and particularly young women, gravitate to the Democratic Party. But the second is race, the single biggest predictor of support right, in terms of splits, is white people are more likely to support Mr. Trump, and everyone else is more likely to support Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris. So these are real divisions. The Trump campaign has been uglier than any that I can recall. I've been in the United States since 1992, right? My very first year in America as a college first-year student was the Bill Clinton, George Bush election. There's never been anything like this in terms of the ugliness of the rhetoric engaged. You know, we're talking right now about Puerto Rico, but 2 weeks ago we were talking about allegations made that Haitian immigrants to Springfield, Ohio were eating cats and dogs and stealing their neighbors' pets. So this is a constant theme. And remember that 8 years ago, Trump referred to Mexicans as rapists and murderers who come across the border to do harm. So this is very much the theme. If you look at the ad buy of the Republican Party in the last week, and including what they've sort of invested in terms of advertisements going forward, it's a heavily antagonistic, anti-trans, people's rights. There's this constant demonization of difference and of others. So it is very polarizing. It is very split apart. It is also an election that is fundamentally about party loyalty and party identity. At the end of the day, there are going to be crossover votes. There always are. The question is how many Republicans cross over to Kamala Harris, because while they remain Republicans, do not identify Mr. Trump's version of republicanism with the party that they grew up with. But for many others, the fundamental choice is between a Republican candidate and a Democratic candidate, and they're going to go there. And so Trump ends up being a candidate who cannot be dismissed because he's got a very high floor, right? There's about 45% of the American public, 43 to 45% that's going to support him. He potentially has a very low ceiling of about 47 to 48% in any poll, right? He's not cracked 49, he's not cracked 50%. So this final week is going to be about turnout and the enthusiasm for the Trump campaign versus the enthusiasm for the Harris campaign is what's going to determine this election.
Right.
But as you point out, because of the nature of their rhetoric, right, on the one hand, this ugly racist campaign that the Republicans have waged against an increasingly confrontational rhetoric on the part of the Democrats, a willingness to call him a fascist, to say that there are elements of the campaign that are outrightly dangerous for democracy, means that the wounds coming out of this election are going to be pretty raw. No one expects Trump to concede the election if he loses, right? We expect there to be a lot of, just like in 2020, a lot of ugly rhetoric, threats of violence, election law cases, etc. So this is going to drag on for a while. And so regardless of outcome, right, if Kamala Harris wins, she's going to be saying, let's turn the page, but we expect the Trump campaign to continue to fan the flames. Of course, if the Trump campaign comes out victorious, I don't think Harris plays the same playbook, but I imagine that for a large number of the people, the post-trauma of 2016 when Hillary lost will be doubly repaid. And so, this is not an election that people are going to move past very quickly. And yet there is one outcome that I think is much more conducive to some sort of healing and democratic resilience than the other.
Jayant Krishna, do you believe also that this election has split America wide open like never before?
Yeah, it seems like, but the outcome is still very is anybody's guess, quite unpredictable. Earlier Kamala Harris, as we all know, had taken a lead, but now the latest poll says that Trump has a lead of 2% over Kamala Harris. It has divided. It has been a pretty not a very positive campaign the way you look at. If you go beyond people and look at business, I think despite the fact that Trump is known to be, quite pro-American business, but more if you go by the fundraising, Kamala Harris has been able to raise more funds than Trump, which if you translate that, it does mean that more business supports Kamala Harris to come to power rather than Trump. Some of the things, Rajdeep, which Trump has announced, it gives me some concern at this point of time, purely from an American economy point of view. He said that across the board he'll increase import tariffs to protect the domestic industry so that, their products are preferred over the imported ones. But if you look at, while it may help the domestic industry to a limited extent, not to an extent he has talked about in his campaign, the fact is higher import duty would lead to higher prices. It would lead to my worry is the inflation, which has been controlled somewhat in the last couple of years, and Fed has a target for 2%, the inflation target for 2%. My worry is how would it, inflation would definitely go up if these import duty proposals of Trump see the light of the day, and if he comes to power.
Okay.
Now there is one more worry on the economy front. If you compare and contrast the economic proposals of Trump and Harris, Trump proposals are likely to lead to a higher government borrowing. And in government borrowings, typically, we have seen all over the world what happens if the volume goes up, scale goes up, it becomes riskier to invest in government securities. Then the rate of interest on government security goes up, which is, I'm told, around 4.25% at this point of time. So higher rate of interest for government securities would mean that government would have to spend more to service those debts. So I think these are the kind of questions that I have, and generally American business also is looking at about the Fed Reserve, that what their next move would be, and whether they will maintain the high rate of rates for longer than it is expected. So I think these are some of the issues more on the business side and less on the people side in the US between the two leaders.
Let's come back though to the people's side, because at the moment that people's side is what will probably decide how who America chooses. And I want to come therefore to the third question, which is linked to the second. What will be the key factors that will decide the US elections? Promitpal Chaudhary, you track US elections carefully. The swing states, as they are called, the 6 or 7, whichever way you want to look at them, the states that will decide this American election. Many believe it's about voter turnout. Who is able to get their base vote in particular out, and in states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, it could go down literally to the wire. Your sense, is it a gender gap between Harris and Trump, white American males versus women, suburbia versus the cities, rural versus urban? What is it, according to you, that will decide this election? You're on mute.
It's a good question, and it's difficult to tell, for one reason being that American polling now is as bad as Indian polling. In the last 2 elections, we have seen the polls in America consistently underestimate Donald Trump's support. In the first election, that made sense. Pollsters claimed, however, they made adjustments. And in the next election, though Biden won, he won by half the percentage points that he was expected to. And this polling is particularly bad in the swing states. There's no clear reason why this continues to be the case, but it means that we don't have a full sense of which candidate will necessarily win in the swing states. And even if the polls are right, if you look at the margins of error, most of the leads, either by Harris or Trump, are essentially within the margin of error in all of them. So, and as I think as others have mentioned, already most voters have already made up their mind. They don't actually care what the candidates are saying. They are going to vote red or blue simply because that's what they believe in, and the narrative is now deeply fixed. Even the number of independent voters is reasonably small, and there is a bit of a battle for that. You can see Harris trying to move to the center, talking about her fact that she has guns in her house and is prepared to use them. Trump trying to compensate, if you wish, for some of the more extreme statements that come out of some of his rallies. You saw that on Puerto Ricans, though to some degree it's a waste of time because Puerto Ricans are the most democratically leaning Hispanic group in the country. So yes, it comes down, I think, increasingly, which is one of the reasons I would argue that the language is getting more and more polarizing as you get down to the last few votes is how many people can you get out? Can you mobilize your base?
Right.
And can you get them out? Because that turnout is now going to be the decisive factor, especially in states where the lead, I mean, Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin are effectively tied. They're 50-50. Leads are as little as 0.5% in a lot of these states. And so you need to get it. You need to mobilize your vote, and you need to mobilize the extreme elements of your support base. Is really where you're going to now be turning to. It's not the independent voters, many of whom may never bother to show up, I suspect.
Kamal Sibal, I'll come to you in a moment, but just to persist with our American guest for a moment, Irfan Nuruddin, a quick answer to this. What is the key factor, according to you, that will decide what happens on the 5th, 6th of November?
There are two. One is sort of how the early vote goes. I mean, America has changed its voting patterns quite dramatically over the last couple of elections as more people have embraced early voting. Even as of the airing of this show, the estimates will be that something on the order of 40 to 45% of all registered voters have already cast their vote, right? I mean, so
Elon Musk on Twitter seems to suggest that the early voting suggests a Trump landslide. Is he bluffing?
Yeah, I wouldn't believe anything Elon Musk has to say on pretty much anything at this point. Unfortunately, the credibility is gone. The patterns that Musk and Trump supporters are leaning on is that at least some of the early voting suggests that Republicans have really heavily shifted to early voting compared to election day voting, which was the case in 2020. On the other hand, high quality surveys of early voters suggest that Kamala Harris leads among the early voters. So one interpretation is that there is a much higher level of vote switching among Republican registered voters towards Harris than was estimated. The other, of course, is that all of this is not particularly accurate and we're reading tea leaves when we should just wait for the results. But so you asked me what are the determinants. One is sort of how does that early voting break, right? If in fact, as in previous elections, Democrats do have an edge going into election day, that means that bodes well for them. On the other hand, if the early voting has really broken for Trump for some reason, that changes the interpretation possibly. Right. The second is that last minute get out the vote operation. And there, most analysts suggest that Harris has a much more elaborate GOTV, get out the vote operation, as one of your guests mentioned, has raised a lot more money that may now be invested in sort of a very manual, labor-intensive, go knock on doors, make a lot of phone calls in a way that the Trump campaign is less well equipped to do in many things. So we'd expect that Trump will be using largely rhetoric to try and mobilize these voters. And for Harris, it'll be really the old-fashioned get-out-the-vote kind of operation that they've invested in quite significantly. The Trump campaign relies pretty heavily on low information, irregular voters to turn out. I mean, so young men in particular, where Trump has a pretty significant advantage, are not your most consistent voters, right? I mean, just to indulge in broad generalizations, older women, especially older suburban women, which are now heavily pro-Harris, are really regular voters. They vote in every election, no matter what. And so this is where that get out the vote operation in the last few days, this last week of the election, are going to be quite critical.
Is a Trump presidency better for India than a Harris one? Kamal Sibal, you mentioned earlier that you believe there will not be significant changes. But as we saw, there was a certain chemistry that Prime Minister Modi seemed to have built with with Trump during his presidency, which was perhaps not quite the same during the Biden presidency. And we don't know how the Harris-Modi equation will run. Traditionally, Democrats have been much tougher on countries like India, on issues like Kashmir, on human rights. That, of course, you could argue was in a previous time. But either way, do you believe broadly a Trump presidency is better for India than a Harris one?
Well, as I said earlier, that Biden's presidency was very good to us. And we gained a lot in terms of very many important areas of cooperation with the United States, especially in the technology area. I mean, the ICET, INDESX, and all that. These are the building blocks of real technological growth in India. And for that, the cooperation with the United States is vital. I mean, if you look around the world, where do you get these kind of technologies from. China, not Russia. Some European countries may have some technology here and there, but in terms of the width that the United States has, and the depth that the United States has, there's no other country. And therefore, United States relationship is very important to us. And as I said, this happened during Biden's presidency, and Biden personally was very gracious towards Prime Minister Modi. Invited him as a chief guest, and also he's addressed the U.S. Congress 2 times during his presidency, which is also unprecedented. On the other hand, Kamala Harris has not been particularly open to India. Prime Minister met her when he went there. He invited her to come to India. She did not come, which is a bit surprising. I thought that for our own presidency and our own ambitions, our own presidential ambitions, and our own vice presidency, if she had come to India, it would have given her a certain profile. She would have benefited from the growth of India-US ties also. But she chose not to do so. Obviously, she has some reservations in her mind now whether when she becomes president, she will overcome those reservations and be more open towards India is a question mark. On the other hand, the ecosystem that got created under Biden's presidency during the Democratic presidency will favor good relations with India. There is the China factor, Indo-Pacific Quad. All these factors are very important in terms of the Americans under the Democratic governance also would.
No, the reason, Mr. Sibal, I asked you this because you will recall that when Trump was president, he came to India. They had a big event. Howdy Modi event was held in Texas. And then when Trump was here, there was a Namaste Trump event in Ahmedabad. Prime Minister Modi went even as far as saying, Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar. It didn't quite work out that way, but there seemed to be a personal chemistry. They are both identified by their admirers as strong nationalist populists. Their critics, of course, see them more as authoritarian. Either way, is that personal chemistry something that could make India feel more comfortable with Trump than they would with Harris, given, as you said, despite the fact that Harris is of Indian origin, a mother from Chennai, she hasn't really come to this country or reached out to the Indian Prime Minister?
I think we will get along with Trump. I have no doubt about that. There would be difficulties, unpredictable, he's mercurial. He's in some ways a bit unstable. But on the other hand, he's capable of taking dramatic decisions. And in some senses, what he wants to do in terms of patching up with Russia, not militarily intervening as America is prone to do, cut costs there and everything else, that would be helpful to us. But in some other areas, in America, make America great again and all that, that can pose some problems.
So let's... let's look at that a bit. You've got Jayant Krishna in someone in Trump who has seemingly a decent relationship with Prime Minister Modi, but you've also got in Trump someone who on tariffs and the economy could very well be America first, could perhaps therefore get into the kind of trade wars that India doesn't want to get in with the US. On balance, is Harris for India a safer choice, given that she's marks continuity from the Biden administration?
See, Rajdeep, I would like to believe so. Kamala Harris, although she's not known to have said much, on US's friendship, American friendship with India in the past. On the contrary, she has made some observations on human rights issues in India and so on and so forth. But I believe she will be a better bet for India. While the chemistry between Trump and Prime Minister Modi is good, but I don't know whether it's just verbosity, just how is it only a surface friendship, or is it deep enough, and what does it bring on the table for India? I think that's very, very important. If you look at one issue which is very, very important, the IT and ITS industry in India, which accounts for almost 8 to 9% of our GDP. US remains the single largest market for Indian IT and IT-enabled services industry. And Trump is reported to have said that he will curtail the visas to be given to Indians and so on and so forth. So I think this is while I know it is more of a posturing. American industry would not let him do that, or he may tweak the visa rules a bit here or there, or quotas a bit here or there. But you can't, because the fact is, America as a country should never lose sight of the fact that they're not doing any favor to Indians by giving visas to Indians. The fact is, so many IT and ITS Indians going to US, it makes their industry very competitive because of reasons of cost arbitrage, because of reasons of productivity, because of the reasons of skills, and we meet to a large extent there's America's skill deficit, I think. So I think my personal belief is Kamala Harris would be a better bet for India
Right.
for a variety of reasons, and more than anything else, being very predictable and at the end of the day, I think the fact that her mother is from India and her Indian origin, I think that would eventually play up in India's favor. Although in the past that has not been the case, at least not been very apparent at all.
Promit, what's your view? The fact that her mother is from Chennai or was born in Chennai, does that, when she was made vice president, there were lots of these profiles of Kamala Harris stressing on her Indian connection. It's not quite worked out that way. Do you see her as the traditional Democrat kind of president who will be tough on India when it comes to certain issues of human rights or religious freedom versus a Trump who may be tough on India when it comes to tariffs?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think it's the fact that she's of Indian ethnic origin or half Indian ethnic origin makes any difference. She will be driven by the interests of what a U.S. president would be, what her advisors do. She'll be familiar with India as a consequence, but she has politically always identified her more or less as a Black African American, and that makes perfect sense politically. So I don't think that is as big a deal as people make it out. In many ways, it may actually make it more difficult for her to be overly conciliatory to India. But she is from the progressive side of the Democratic Party. Look at when she ran for the presidency, when she served as a senator, when she ran as a Democratic candidate in the primaries, she positioned herself very much on the left of that party. And she was extremely critical of Modi. She was critical of India's decision to abrogate Article 370, said America should be prepared to intervene in Kashmir. So now these are partly rhetorical, partly because she wasn't really, in my view, a serious candidate at the end. And obviously, since she became vice president and since she's become a genuine presidential candidate, we're not hearing that stuff. But her overall view, I think, and her demeanor has been that Modi is a right-wing person, and I don't really like him that much. But keep this in mind: while Democratic presidents rhetorically give India a bit of a hard time on democratic backsliding, there is another element of Modi's foreign policy which is very important to him, which is climate, and there it is he cannot work with the Republicans. When the Trump administration came to power the first time, all of the G2G efforts in climate, which Modi takes very seriously, he sees that as a genuine existential problem for India, had to be abandoned. He tried very hard to figure out ways to work around that. He did work around, for example, with Bolsonaro, another climate denialist, but he was unable to do so with Trump. I would argue, actually, I disagree with the argument that he has a special relationship with Trump. Modi does what he thinks is necessary to get his policies through. I would argue, in fact, he thinks Biden was a much, much better person, easier person to work with. And I would argue that, unlike in the case of Trump, Biden genuinely admired, from what I've heard him tell at his age, admired Modi. He saw this as a man with a remarkable vision. And told somebody I know, this is the smartest leader in Asia that I've ever met. So no, Biden is good. Harris, I don't think will be a major issue. She's coming in with very little executive experience. She will depend on a foreign policy team that will be almost half Biden. Our foreign minister's already met Philip Gordon, the man likely to be our national security advisor, and has basically come out and said, I don't see any real discontinuity here as far as our strategic interests are concerned. So I expect definitely for the first year and a half of a Harris presidency or administration to be very much Biden light. I don't think it'll be very different at all. After that, we may see her assert herself a bit, but I don't see any major issues there.
So
Tariffs are a problem.
Let's come to the very end of the show. We just got about 4 or 5 minutes and ask the final question on our roundtable. And I'm going to put you, Irfan, on the spot because you're there in Washington where it's going to all happen next week. Who is more likely to win and why? We asked this question earlier about the X factors that will decide this US election. But put yourself on the line, given the numbers that are coming out, some saying dead heat, some giving a slight edge to Trump in the polls. And remember, Trump's been underestimated both in 2016 and 2020. Is Trump, as the bookies are suggesting now, the favorite to become the next president?
I don't believe so. My own analysis of the survey data and of the early data, and I'm happy to, well, I'd be very sad to be wrong, but I'd be willing to admit that I was wrong, is that Kamala Harris wins and potentially wins quite comfortably. I suspect that the blue wall, as it's called, of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania all swing to her. And remember, with those three, it doesn't matter what happens in any of the other places, she wins. I think she's very competitive in North Carolina, and it's quite possible, depending on how turnout in the Atlanta suburbs goes, that Georgia is once again in play, but very, very close.
But you're saying Pennsylvania, you're making a big call. You're suggesting Pennsylvania, which could be the key to who becomes the next president, could go with Kamala Harris.
I think it's quite likely that Pennsylvania goes with Kamala Harris. And while it is true that in 2016 and 2020, the polls underestimated support for Mr. Trump, in 2022, when the polls were predicting a red wave, right in the midterm elections, with a lot of Trump sort of endorsed candidates that did not materialize, suggesting possibly that the polls have overcorrected in many ways over here. As in India and as in any modern polling operation, the devil's in the details. These are not pure random samples. There's a lot of art, there's a lot of weight supplied, etc. So one does want to be pretty careful, especially among these swing states. But if I were a betting person, my money would be comfortably on Kamala Harris at this moment.
Okay, so your money's on Kamala Harris. Jayan Krishna, very quickly, who's your money on, if you're a betting man?
So Rajdeep, I wouldn't like to hazard a guess. It could go any way. Two things would decide, to my mind. One is the turnout, and other is which way eventually the women in the US vote. I have a feeling that they will tilt a little more towards Kamala Harris as the elections get closer. It could be anybody's game. Very difficult to predict, Rajdeep.
The pollsters are having a nightmare. They had a nightmarish election in India in 2024, which we thought the general election would be a dead cert for a big Modi win. Didn't happen. In Haryana, they were predicting a Congress win. The BJP won. And now the pollsters, at least the betting odds are on Harris, and many believe that the betting companies usually get it better than pollsters, but we don't know. Kamal Sibal, are you a betting man? And do you want to tell us, in this Diwali season, who are you betting on, if you were a betting man?
Frankly,
very quickly.
Not our national election. It is the U.S. national election. They have stakes in it. We don't have that kind of a stakes in it. Nor do we.
Do you have a preferred? Okay, let me be more direct. Do you have a preferred candidate? If you were a U.S. citizen, who would you vote for?
None. I have no preference.
Oh, you have no. Okay.
Either of the two, if he or she wins.
Okay, that's an interesting answer. Promit Pal Chaudhary, are you a betting man? I don't know. This is Diwali season. People play cards for big money. I'm asking you a question. Who wins the U.S. election?
No, I'm not a betting man, and as a Bengali, my festivities are actually already over. Durga Puja, and you do not bet and gamble at Durga Puja. Female goddesses have a different point of view on those things.
So who are you betting on?
And I have not had chance, as I've had previous elections, to be on the ground in the United States. It's much harder for me to estimate or get a sense of it. I would actually give it a slight edge to Trump, but I'm looking at something like 51-49. I think it's really close. And I'm not so certain about Pennsylvania. But again, I'm sitting very far away. Right. So it's really hard to say.
Well, Pennsylvania could be one of those key states that decides a U.S. election. It's very interesting that the U.S. system usually sees that you can win, as did Hillary Clinton, the popular vote share, and still lose. And that's because the U.S. presidential system, the swing states, and we've mentioned some of them, do matter, and Pennsylvania perhaps this time more than any other. But that is part of the excitement, that you've got an election which at least some pollsters at the moment, perhaps playing safe, are suggesting a dead heat. And as our panel today on the roundtable has suggested, whoever comes to America simply because where the United States still lies in the world order, it will make a difference. And we do live in turbulent times, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Europe, and whether it is in parts of Asia as well. So to all our panelists, thank you very much for joining us. I hope you have a restful Diwali weekend. And we'll wait and see who bursts the crackers in the White House come this November 6th. That's the day that we will know who has won the battle for the United States, the battle for the White House. That was a special roundtable. Thanks for watching. Bye for now. Jai Hind, Shubhratri. Have a good Diwali.
जाओगे कैसे?
हेलो, मैं आ रहा हूँ, भगा कर ले जाऊंगा। सिक्योरिटी, भाग गए, पकड़ो उनको। हेलो, बोला था ना, भगा कर ले जाऊंगा।
एक हिंट तो देते?
हिंट,
बड़े आराम से।
Motorola Razr 50 Ultra comes with Google Gemini.
एक दोस्त है जिससे बात किए बिना हम रह नहीं सकते, बातें घंटों की हों या कुछ सेकंड्स की। ये दोस्त हमेशा हमारी बात सुनता है, क्योंकि हमारा सबसे अच्छा दोस्त भगवान ही तो है। मंगलदीप, दिल से करो बात भगवान के साथ।
Colors by Cola makes you wish everything was as vibrant.
ना धूप चुने ना छाँव, कैसे तेरी खुद गर्जी, किसे ठोर टिके ना पाँव, कैसे तेरी खुद गर्जी, ना धूप चुने ना छाँव, कैसे तेरी खुद गर्जी।
मिलिए रेखा भारद्वाज, साहित्य आज तक दिल्ली में लाइव 22, 23 और 24 नवंबर, मेजर ध्यानचंद नेशनल स्टेडियम, इंडिया गेट, नई दिल्ली। आज ही अपनी टिकट बुक करें aajtak.in/साहित्य पर।
Bosch electronic seat by Kohler. Wish everything was this intelligent.
Hello and welcome. You watching India First. I'm Gaurav Sawant. Former US President Donald Trump has condemned the barbaric violence